So Nicola Sturgeon appeared before the UK COVID inquiry this week, and it seems to have finally almost dawned on the commentariat that she's not actually a saint in the way that they seem to believe. So there's been a couple of quite significant accusations held at her. She's been accused, and she's admitted actually to deleting pretty much all of her WhatsApps from her time in office during the pandemic. Despite the fact that she said when the inquiry was announced that she wanted to be fully transparent, she's been accused of buying burner phones or allowing staff to use burner phones paid for with Scottish Government expenses, again to wriggle out of having the messages read. And maybe most significantly, she's been accused, and I think this is a pretty fair accusation, of politicising the pandemic, of using it as a sort of platform to push for Scottish independence. Tom, what have you made of this and the sort of unravelling of Sturgeon?
Like you, I'm struck by the fact that it's this week that it's these set of accusations which have made everyone realise that maybe she's not the most wonderful human being who ever existed, that it was her kind of admitting, and yes, it was very shady and embarrassing, and she was caught out on a lie effectively, which is something which is always going to make people reappraise this individual who they built up as being so wonderful. But if you think about all the other things she's been responsible for in recent years, if you think about the ongoing criminal investigation into her and her husband about the alleged misuse of party funds, if you think about all of the various kind of internal scandal that they had over the Alex Salmond allegations and the allegation from him that the SNP led by Nicola Sturgeon were launching effectively a witch hunt against him, which if nothing else, even if you don't believe the full extent of those claims, the very clear way in which the offices of the Scottish state were used to try and suppress some of his evidence being put before MPs, all of these things were very, very shady. So you've got that. You've got some of the policies she's been responsible for, which long before COVID were insanely authoritarian. You know, the named person scheme wasn't something she came up with, but certainly was something that she cheerleaded, assigning a state guardian to every child. This is really sinister stuff. Even that Supreme Court case where her plan to hold an unconstitutional referendum on breaking up the United Kingdom was something that just came and went without much discussion, even though when Boris Johnson tried to prorogue Parliament for a couple of extra days, people talked about it as if it was our January 6th moment, So this is the complete disparity between the things that she's actually been caught doing and in some cases knocked back and punished for doing, just never really registered. And obviously on the one hand that's just double standards. People like her or agree with her or like the fact that she gives it to the Tories and therefore she gets a free pass on certain issues. But I think it's also a reminder that a lot of the things that they've gotten very hysterical about in recent years when the government does it, when they start calling the Tories authoritarian and fascist and so on, the Scottish government have sort of pioneered with the SNP a kind of form of authoritarianism which is really stark, really extreme, and as I say, goes well beyond COVID. And yet, because they like it, because they agree with it, because it's going to clamp down on views that they dislike, or it's going to meddle in the lifestyles of people that they don't much care for or whatever, they've just been fine with it. So yeah, it's interesting that it's this that it's unravelling about, but it wasn't any of the other scandals or any of the other insane policies that she actually implemented. It's
worth saying with this the named person scheme, it was struck down by the Supreme Court as being in breach of human rights. Now, supposedly that's the worst crime the worst thing you can do in society today. It was a really draconian policy. The idea would be that you'd literally have people from the state finding out, how kids' bedrooms were decorated, were they consulted on what TV programs, they're allowed to watch, to find out if their parents are abusing them, essentially. It's just completely mad. Jacob, one thing that has obviously, this being the COVID inquiry, it has led a lot of people maybe to reassess Nicola Sturgeon's pandemic performance. It seemed as if every time, she took every opportunity to be just that bit more authoritarian than Johnson, which is quite incredible considering how authoritarian the English lockdowns were.
Yeah, well, I think in a way you might see this as slightly a kind of a way of letting off the hook some people for subscribing to and supporting what were her increasingly draconian measures, and the revelations that you've talked about in terms of how she deliberately sought to politicize their response to the pandemic. Obviously, the pandemic is a political matter, so there's nothing wrong with some politics being involved, but the way that she tried to constantly distinguish herself from and use it as a grandstanding attempt to say that, we're the ones that take health seriously. It's the nasty people in Westminster and nasty Boris Johnson who doesn't care about people's health, and we're kind of the good and the moral and the virtuous ones because we're going to do extra clampdowns whenever we see. And that very deliberate policy has really been exposed. And in a way, there is this element, I think, of people looking back on that and thinking maybe we shouldn't have gone along with some of this. Maybe it was all a bit too far, and she's kind of like, this has become the issue that she's tripped up on. And it is worth saying that the details that you've outlined in terms of burner phones, it's like something from like a kind of post-war small corrupt European country rather than like the kind of 21st century country. There's this kind of mafia element to the way that the SNP operates, which I think, as much as you're right, Tom, that obviously that you could have pinned a lot of scandals on her in the past. It's like when it's so obvious and so blatant, the kind of this kind of clan-like mafia behavior of the SNP really stands exposed. And I mean, in a way, sadly, this issue, Nicola Sturgeon will take the fall for it to some degree, and the broader kind of structure of SNP power in Scotland remains largely unchallenged. Sure, Labour might make up some seats in the next election in Scotland, but the way that Scotland has turned into this kind of semi-autonomous, as I say, mafia-style state is like that we really need to get to grips with.
And Labour obviously agrees with every authoritarian measure that the SNP has put forward. Tom, I mean, certainly Nicola Sturgeon represents, I think, it's fair to say, a style of leader that we've come to know and love, or not love so much. You kind of put her in the same category I would as Jacinda Ardern or Justin Trudeau. This kind of liberal, strong person.
Liberal strong man, liberal strong woman, and not so liberal as it turns out. I think that's exactly right. And I think there's clearly those leaders are kind of in conversation with one another. There's a whole range of issues which needn't be related yet are for some reason, and that you see repeatedly kind of leapt upon by each of these leaders. I mean, the fact that, for instance, the Scottish National Party, which allegedly its aim is to break up the United Kingdom, the fact that the thing that brought one of its most successful leaders down was because she was determined to put rapists in women's prisons. It's a really striking kind of fact that there is an array of kind of elite issues which they are really preoccupied with. They will push it through by any means necessary, and yet they're things which are deeply unpopular, authoritarian, damaging. And we see that kind of across the piece, and also inability to recognise how authoritarian or just demented a lot of these policies are on the part of the commentariat, who treat all of those three figures certainly as if they are kind of earthbound saints, like they're wonderful. How could you possibly dislike them, even though what they're doing is incredibly damaging and are often carrying on in an incredibly authoritarian, if not corrupt, fashion. So it's been fascinating how the halo of these sorts of policies, how that seems to mean that no one wants to criticise them in the mainstream media, but also just how similar the agenda is of a lot of these different political parties, which are generally seen as kind of centre-left-ish, whatever that means these days. But there's no reason why, certainly in a historical sense, they'd be so attached to all of these things, particularly if they're supposedly liberal left, as they're often characterised.
Yeah, I mean, they're all very hardline on lockdown, all very into the trans issue, of course, and all very into green stuff. I mean, that seems to be one of the big overarching things, which is especially interesting in the case of the SNP, because the case for Scottish independence for so long was built on the idea that there's all this oil wealth that is going to, the United Kingdom and could be Scotland's. But now, by the time Nicola Sturgeon left, the SNP policy was actually, we don't want to dig any more oil out of the North Sea. So they even contradict their own sort of founding principles for these newer kind of elite ideals.
Yeah, it's very right, Tom, to point out the way that lots of these people have kind of become undone in a similar time. I mean, Trudeau's still going, but you might kind of add Angela Merkel into the mix a little bit, in the way that someone who always kind of presented the right image, but actually when you scratch the surface of there wasn't kind of much of political substance there, and this strange left liberal identification with somebody who's kind of, it is almost like a reflection of the Blair era. They're kind of good enough on camera. They say some of the right things and know how to word things, but actually they haven't got any answers to any of the problems that are facing their country at a fundamental level. The SNP's kind of the failed case for independence being a good case in point. No kind of vision of what Scotland might look like independent, other than kind of not the rest of the UK. And so they've all become undone because they don't have anything of substance to them, really. And I think so. It's good we can celebrate these things coming undone. We need a little bit more of the active pushback, because we can't just always rely on the fact that the elites will end up floundering in their own kind of incompetence. But so we need a little bit more of the pushback, but we can welcome that they're kind of falling from grace. It
is interesting as well how, in a sense, it shows how easily impressed the media are, or at least how focused on quite superficial things. They are, because I think Merkel's another good example, you know, sort of centre-right, but still very much that kind of centrist establishment. Was seen as so wonderful for so long. And now, you know, in the space of months, her entire reputation as like the greatest post-war leader that Europe has ever had is completely unravelled, because not only did she pursue a lot of policies which were mad and damaging, but of course a lot of the people who ended up writing a political obituary agree with all of those things. But she was also just incredibly inept. I mean, she sorted up all of these tremendous social and economic problems for Germany, which are now coming home to roost. So a lot of these people, are, as well as being wrong uns, are really rubbish as well. But just because of the fact that they sounded the right notes, or they looked a certain way, or they were young and fresh and interesting, or just drop dead gorgeous, and Justin Trudeau's case, they thought they were the dog's bollocks. Like they are, they say populist voters, you know, they're just won over by Trump or Boris being a bit funny or whatever, but I think they are much more vapid.